Raising a 4-year-old daughter was no easy task, but for Clara it was her pride and joy. She and her husband, Ethan, had agreed early on that she would take a break from her career to focus on their daughter Mia. Clara had built a daily routine that balanced parenting with a sprinkle of personal freedom, moments stolen for coffee, books, and the occasional manicure. On most days, she felt content with the life she'd built, but that Tuesday afternoon would shatter her illusion of simplicity forever. Clara had just dropped Mia off at her afternoon music class, a bright little space tucked into the corner of their neighborhood. With 90 minutes to herself, she decided to grab coffee from her favorite cafe, a quaint spot where the smell of roasted beans and cinnamon always felt like home. She pushed open the cafe door, greeted by the familiar hum of quiet conversations and the soft clink of coffee cups. But as her eyes scanned the room for an empty table, she froze. There he was, her father, Richard. He was seated in the far corner, partially obscured by a potted plant. But it was unmistakably him. The salt and pepper hair, the navy blazer he always wore to work. Clara smiled at first. How odd, she thought. Dad never mentioned being in the area. Her smile vanished as quickly as it came. Across from him sat a woman, elegant, younger than her mother, and dressed in a way that oozed confidence. Clara watched in stunned silence as her father leaned in, brushing the woman's hand with his own. Then the unthinkable. He kissed her. Clara felt her stomach twist, a nauseating wave of disbelief and anger crashing over her. She stumbled out of the cafe, unable to process what she had just seen. Her father, her rock, her hero, cheating on her mother. She wandered the streets for what felt like hours, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal. By the time she made it home, Mia was already fast asleep, and Ethan was engrossed in a documentary. Clara barely acknowledged him, collapsing onto the couch and staring blankly at the ceiling. What was she supposed to do? Should she tell her mom? Confront her father? Pretend it never happened? The next morning, Clara resolved to act. She couldn't let this sit. Her mother, Diane, deserved to know the truth. Clara waited until Mia was at preschool before heading over to her parents' house. She hadn't slept much the night before, her brain replaying the scene at the cafe like a broken record. As she pulled into the driveway, her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Diane greeted her at the door, her smile warm and welcoming as always. Clara, what a nice surprise. Clara stepped inside, her palms clammy and her throat dry. Hi, Mom. Do you have a minute? I need to talk to you about something. Diane frowned slightly but nodded, leading Clara into the kitchen. She poured them both tea and sat across from her, her hands folded neatly on the table. What's on your mind, sweetheart? Clara hesitated. How was she supposed to say this? How could she look her mother in the eye and tell her that her husband was unfaithful? Mom, I don't know how to say this, but yesterday I saw Dad at a cafe with another woman. Diane's face didn't change. No shock. No anger. Just quiet, composed attention. Clara continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. They were holding hands. He kissed her, Mom. I didn't know what to do. I thought you should know. For a long moment, Diane said nothing. Then, to Clara's utter astonishment, she smiled faintly and reached across the table to squeeze her hand. I appreciate you telling me, Clara.
But
I already know. Clara's mouth fell open. You know. Diane nodded, her expression serene. Your father and I have an understanding. We have a free relationship. The words hit Clara like a bucket of cold water. A free relationship? Yes, Diane said, her tone calm and measured. We love each other deeply, but we also believe in giving each other the freedom to explore. It's not something everyone understands, and that's okay. It works for us. Clara felt like the floor had just dropped out from under her. The parents she thought she knew, the perfect, stable couple who had been married for 35 years, were suddenly strangers. But how? Clara stammered. How can you be okay with that? With him being with someone else? Diane smiled gently, as though she were explaining a complicated concept to a child. It's not about being okay with it. It's about trust, respect. Your father and I have a bond that goes beyond physical exclusivity. We've raised our family, built a life together. But we're also individuals, Clara. And sometimes, that means allowing each other the space to be ourselves. Clara couldn't believe what she was hearing. She felt like she was in a parallel universe where nothing made sense. The days that followed were a blur of conflicted emotions. Clara couldn't stop thinking about her parents' arrangement, how foreign it felt compared to her own beliefs about love and marriage. She found herself questioning everything. How could her mother be so calm about it? Was it possible to love someone and still share them with others? Would she ever be able to look at her father the same way? She tried talking to Ethan about it one night, but the conversation quickly turned heated. "Wait," Ethan said, his fork paused midair. "Your parents have an open marriage." Clara winced. "I guess. I don't know. Mom called it a free relationship." Ethan frowned. "And you're just okay with that?" "No," Clara snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm not okay with it. It goes against everything I believe about family, about loyalty." Ethan set his fork down, studying her carefully. "But it's their marriage, not yours. If it works for them, isn't that what matters?" Clara shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. "I don't know. It just feels wrong. Like everything I thought I knew about love and commitment was a lie." Ethan sighed, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Clara, your parents' choices don't define you. You get to decide what kind of relationship you want, what values you want to live by. This doesn't change who you are." His words were meant to comfort her, but they only deepened her turmoil. Unable to keep the turmoil inside any longer, Clara decided to confront her father. She waited until Mia was at daycare and drove to his office, her heart pounding. Richard looked surprised when she walked in, but he greeted her warmly. "Clara, what brings you here?" Clara wasted no time. "Dad, we need to talk." His smile faltered. "All right. What's on your mind?" Clara sat down, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "I know about the other woman. Mom told me everything." Richard's expression shifted, a mix of resignation and concern. "Clara, I'm sorry you found out this way. I know this must be hard for you to understand." "Hard to understand?" Clara echoed, her voice rising. "Dad, you've been my role model my whole life. You and Mom were my example of what a healthy relationship looks like. And now I find out you're cheating on her." "It's not cheating," Richard said firmly. "Your mother and I made this decision together. It's not something we advertise, but it's a choice we made as equals." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I just don't get it, Dad. How can you love someone and still do this?" Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Clara, love isn't always black and white. Your mother and I love each other deeply. But love doesn't mean ownership. It doesn't mean putting each other in a box. This is what works for us. It doesn't mean it has to work for you." Clara left her father's office feeling more confused than ever. But over the next few weeks, something began to shift. Through countless conversations with Ethan, her friends, and even Diane, Clara started to realize that her parents' choices didn't have to define her own beliefs. They weren't a betrayal of her values. They were a reflection of theirs. One evening, as she sat with Ethan on their balcony, Clara finally put her feelings into words. "I think I've been so angry because I felt like their choices invalidated everything I believed about love and family," she said. "But I'm starting to see that love isn't one size fits all. What works for them doesn't have to work for me." Ethan nodded, squeezing her hand. "Exactly. You get to write your own story, Clara." For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a sense of peace. She didn't fully understand her parents' choices, and maybe she never would, but she didn't have to. Her story was hers to write, and in that realization she found freedom. The weeks that followed Clara's realization were like learning to walk again. Her anger towards her parents, especially her father, began to soften. She didn't agree with their choices, and she didn't have to, but she no longer felt like those choices betrayed her or defined her own values. One Sunday, Clara decided to invite her parents over for dinner. It had been a while since they'd spent time together as a family, and though the tension still lingered in her mind, she wanted to start mending the bridge. The evening was uneventful at first. Mia, as always, was the glue that held everyone together. Her laughter filled the room as she showed her grandparents her latest drawings. Diane doted on her, and even Richard seemed more relaxed than Clara had seen him in weeks. But the unspoken tension finally surfaced after Mia went to bed. Clara sat across from her parents, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her napkin. She hadn't planned to bring up the subject again, but something in her wouldn't let it rest. "I've been thinking about everything," Clara began cautiously, her eyes darting between Diane and Richard. "About your relationship and the choices you've made." Her father leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, while Diane's gaze softened. "And," her mother prompted gently. Clara exhaled deeply. "I still don't fully understand it. Honestly, I don't think I ever will. But I've realized something. It doesn't have to make sense to me. What matters is that it works for you." Richard looked surprised, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Thank you, Clara. That means more than you know." Diane reached across the table, placing her hand over Clara's. "We never wanted to hurt you. But we also didn't want to hide who we are." Clara nodded, her throat tightening. "I get that now. I don't agree with it, but I get it. And I want to move forward. I want us to still be a family." For the first time since that fateful day in the cafe, Clara felt a sense of peace. Though Clara had made peace with her parents' lifestyle, adjusting to it was another story. She found herself hyper-aware of their interactions, wondering constantly if their free relationship was as harmonious as they claimed. One evening, as she sat with her mother during a rare one-on-one visit, Clara decided to broach the subject she had been avoiding. "Mom," she began hesitantly, "can I ask you something? How do you deal with jealousy? Or insecurity? Doesn't it ever bother you?" Diane set down her cup of tea and gave her daughter a thoughtful look. "Of course it does," she admitted. "I'm human, Clara. There are moments when I feel a pang of jealousy, or when I question whether this is the right path. But your father and I are committed to open communication. When something bothers me, I tell him. And when something bothers him, he tells me. We work through it together." Clara furrowed her brow. "But isn't it exhausting? Constantly navigating all these feelings and boundaries." "It can be," Diane said honestly. "But every relationship has its challenges, Clara. Some couples fight about money, or parenting, or how they spend their time. We fight about these things, too. And sometimes, we fight about our other relationships. But at the end of the day, we choose each other. That's what makes it worth it." Clara sat back, mulling over her mother's words. She still couldn't imagine living like that herself, but for the first time, she began to see the depth of love and effort her parents put into their marriage. Clara's understanding of her parents was put to the test in a way she hadn't anticipated. One evening, as she was scrolling through her phone, she came across an old message from Ethan. It was a playful, flirty text he'd sent her years ago when they were still dating. The memory made her smile, but it also stirred something deeper, a reminder of how far they'd come. But when she glanced up, she saw Ethan sitting across the room, his phone in hand and an odd expression on his face. His brows were furrowed, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, setting her phone down. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "I got a message from an old friend today. She used to be someone I was close with before you and I met." Clara's stomach tightened. "Close how?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with hesitation. "We dated briefly, but it wasn't serious. She just reached out to say hi." I didn't respond. Clara felt a wave of emotions crash over her. The logical part of her knew Ethan had done nothing wrong, but the emotional part of her couldn't help but feel a sting of jealousy. For the first time, she thought of her mother and the calm way she had spoken about jealousy and communication. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Clara asked, her voice softer than she expected. "I didn't want to upset you," Ethan admitted. "But then I realized that hiding it would probably make things worse." Clara nodded, taking a deep breath. "I appreciate you telling me. I do.
But
I think I need some time to process this." Ethan looked relieved and concerned all at once. "Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that I love you, Clara. You and Mia are my whole world." As the evening wore on, Clara found herself reflecting on her parents again. She didn't want an open relationship, but maybe there was something to learn from their approach to honesty and trust. Feeling the need for perspective, Clara decided to reach out to her father. She invited him for a walk in the park, something they hadn't done in years. As they strolled along the winding paths, Clara finally spoke up. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Richard said, his hands tucked into his pockets. "How do you deal with doubt? In your relationship with Mom, I mean. How do you stay so confident in what you have?" Richard glanced at her, a faint smile on his lips. I think it comes down to choice, Clara. Every day, I choose your mother. Even when it's hard, even when there's doubt. Love isn't always a feeling. Sometimes it's a decision. Clara mulled over his words. But what if that doubt eats away at you? What if it makes you question everything? Richard stopped walking, turning to face her. Then you talk about it. You face it head on. Doubt is natural, Clara. It's what you do with it that matters. For the first time, Clara saw her father not as a man who had betrayed her ideal of marriage, but as someone who was navigating love in his own way. As Clara walked back home, her conversation with her father played over in her mind. She thought about her parents' relationship, about Ethan, and about the kind of love she wanted to build in her own life. That evening, she sat down with Ethan after Mia had gone to bed. She told him about her feelings, her fears, and her hopes for their future. She told him how much she valued his honesty and how she wanted to build a relationship where they could always trust each other. Ethan listened intently, his hand clasping hers. Clara, I want that too. I want us to be a team, no matter what life throws at us. In that moment, Clara realized that love wasn't about fitting into a mold or following a set of rules. It was about finding what worked for them. Honesty, respect, and a shared commitment to each other. As she leaned into Ethan's embrace, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't had in months. Her parents' relationship didn't have to define her own. She could respect their choices while building a love that was uniquely hers. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt at peace.